Hello and welcome back to All About Russia. My name is Andrew and in this video we're going to be looking at the Pearl of Siberia, the Irkutsk Oblast. The Irkutsk Oblast is located in the east of Russia, in the Siberian Federal District and in the East Siberian Economic Region. It is the fifth largest federal subject at nearly 300,000 square miles in size, making it larger than the nation of Chile. The Irkutsk Oblast is the 20th most populous federal subject of the Russian Federation, with a population larger than Botswana. The Irkutsk Oblast borders the Sakha Republic to the north, the Zabaikalsky Krai to the east, the Buryat Republic to the south, the Tuva Republic to the southwest, and the Krasnoyarsk Krai to the west. The highest point in the oblast is Peak Tofalaria, which stands at over 1,400 meters in height and is named after the Tofala people. The longest river in the oblast is the Angara at 1,149 miles, of which 580 of those miles flows through the oblast. The name Angara actually comes from the Buryat language and means something akin to opening or cleft. The Irkutsk Oblast is heavily forested, with woodland making up over 80% of the oblast. Only 2.7% of the land in the oblast is under plough, with mountains, waterways and urban areas making up the remaining 14.5%. The Irkutsk Oblast has 33 administrative districts, with the capital Irkutsk as its own administrative district. Due to the sheer size of the oblast, having absorbed the Ust-Orda Buryat Okrug, it has various districts with ethnically non-Russian populations. The Nizhnoodinsky district is home to the Tofala people, for whom Peak Tofalaria is named. The Olkhonsky district is home to large numbers of Buryats bordering Lake Baikal, whilst the Khatansky district is home to large numbers not only of Buryats but of Venks as well. The entire oblast runs on Irkutsk Standard Time, which is 5 hours ahead of Moscow time and stands at GMT+8. In the same time zone as the Philippines, the flag of the oblast is a white background, flanked with blue rectangles with a black tiger holding a red sable in the centre, surrounded by cedar branches. The white background represents purity, with the blue flanks representing the Angara and Baikal, the two main waterways of the region. The black tiger is an older depiction of a babir, or a large cat of the east, referring to both the Turkic origins of the region as well as the assumed qualities of such animals, prudence and humility. The red sable, a traditionally valuable asset, represents courage, whilst the cedar branches represent the forested land of the oblast. The flag was adopted on the 16th of July 1997. The first traces of human settlement in the area come from the small village of Malta, where remains suggest humans have lived in the region since at least 40,000 BC. Archaeologists are unsure of who these first settlers were, as the region was in constant flux and change. Over the centuries, the Irkutsk Oblast would see dozens of kingdoms, khanates and empires covering and including the area. The earliest records record the Xiongnu Empire in the 3rd century BC, followed by the Janbei Khanate in the 1st century BC, both occupying the area. The last state recorded to have dominance in the area was the Rouran Khanate of the 3rd century, which collapsed in the 5th. This in turn leaves huge patches of blank spots in the history of the Irkutsk Oblast. As we discussed on our video of the Republic of Buryatia, with whom much of its history is shared with the Irkutsk Oblast, a Proto-Buryat people are documented as having lived in the area from around the 5th century AD. Merkits, Buryats, Barga and Tumeds all were recorded as living around Lake Baikal, stretching out across into the Irkutsk Oblast, driving cattle and raiding rival tribes of Yeniseian people such as the Ket and the San and the Venks. For a long time, life in the region would be the same cycle of herding, migration, subjugation and freedom. This cycle would only change in the 13th century with the arrival of the Mongols. Mongol rule brought the diverse peoples of the region together into one unified force. The waste and destruction the Mongols brought moved people both in and out of the area, destroying settlements and establishing new ones. When the Mongol Empire fell into pieces, the land of the Irkutsk Oblast fell under the control of the Yuan dynasty in 1264. When they themselves were ousted from China in 1368, Mongolians continued to rule the area, at least nominally, surrounding Lake Baikal as the Northern Yuan. As mentioned in our video on the Buryat people, in the 15th century, the Khalkha Mongols came to supremacy across the steppe, subjugating many of the minor ethnic groups across the Angara River and around Lake Baikal to their domination. This had been the norm across the steppe for centuries, and thus can be seen as yet another chapter in this same story of rudimentary Mongolian existence. But what no one realised was that this was one of the final chapters in this story. In 1609, the first Cossacks appear in what would one day become the Irkutsk Oblast, seeking furs and fortune. Finding themselves in conflict with the native Buryats, one of the most militarily successful and dominant people in the entirety of Siberia, the Cossacks tried to impose yasak and even baptism upon them. This was unsuccessful, but led to a spate of Cossack ostrogs and outposts littering across the Angara and other rivers. Firstly, the Rybinsky Ostrog. Due to the amount of furs found in this part of unspoiled Siberia, further Cossacks and Promyshelniki headed east in search for their fortune. This was violently opposed by the Buryats, and for the first half of the 17th century, an unofficial state of war existed between Russians and Buryats. Buryats burning down forts, only to have the Cossacks rebuild them once again. By 1643, the Russians had reached Lake Baikal, and by 1648, they had crossed the Angara. In 1655, Cossack leader Peter Beketov reached a détente with the Buryat tribes, leading to an opening of the western part of Irkutsk to Russian settlement. In 1652, Ivan Pokhabov founded a winter trading post dealing with the Buryat tribes in the region, a settlement that would, one day, become the city of Irkutsk. In 1661, an ostrog was established nearby to impose yasak on the tribes that remained. Throughout this time, but particularly post 1655, a steady trickle of Russians emerged in the area. Cossacks and Promyshelniki seeking their fortunes, peasants seeking a better and new life, and importantly for our story, exiles. In Russian society, exile to Siberia, to katorga, was a relatively common practice, and was often used to both punish the perpetrators as well as boost Russian control of a region. Once in Siberia, all manner of horse thieves, rapists, and counterfeiters could become blacksmiths, traders, and upstanding members of society. Siberia, though a land of hardship, was for a long time for the Russian people a land of opportunity. In 1686, enough people had made their lives and homes in Irkutsk to warrant its establishment as a royal town, complete with its own monastery founded in 1672. Due to Siberia being a place of exile and adventure, the demographics were always skewed against women. Naturally, this led to a lot of mixing with indigenous groups, and very quickly a Creole population was established in the Irkutsk Oblast, as would later happen across most of Russia. By the year 1700, Irkutsk was established as one of the leading economic centers in the whole of Siberia, serving as the gateway to the wealth of Siberia, and despite occasional Buryat aggression, being actually besieged in 1695, the city thrived, being close enough to the highly profitable Chinese trading post of Kyatka to take advantage of the high prices silks, furs, and tea commanded. Since 1580, the region had been categorized as part of the Tobolsk discharge, being broken up and put in the Verkhotsky discharge in 1687, before being reincorporated into the Tobolsk discharge once more in 1693, and lastly incorporated into the Siberian province in 1708. This chopping and changing was in part to help with the administration and supply of the region, as well as a measure to oppose corruption, which was a large problem in early Siberia's history. As the saying goes, God is above and the Tsar far away, and corruption would be a regular problem in Irkutsk for many centuries. The Irkutsk province was created in 1724 within the Siberian province, and the following year Vitus Bering would first arrive in the city. He would use the city as a base of operations for his later explorations of the Kamchatka Peninsula and of course the Bering Strait, which bears his name. The wealth coming in from trade as well as from farms popping up across the oblast encouraged further immigration and investment. In 1706, the first stone church, the Spassky Church, was built in Irkutsk, with the first schoolhouse following in 1725. Following Vitus Bering's successful second journey around Kamchatka, mapping it as not an island, a seafaring school was established in 1754, encouraging greater exploration of the riverways and oceans of Siberia. Throughout the 1760s, work on a dedicated route to Tobolsk and further on to Moscow was established, making both travel and commerce even easier. In 1764, the Irkutsk province was separated from the Siberian province, owing to the region's wealth and power. By the end of the century, Russian immigration was in full swing, with both free peasants and exiles making new lives for themselves along the Angara River. Modern capitalism followed too, with the Sherikov-Golikov Fur Company forming in 1780, followed by the Russo-American Company in 1799. One of the reasons for the good fortune of the area stems back to the 1730s, and the reality that the last vestiges with the Buryat tribes had been extinguished, having come to terms with the various clan leaders. Irkutsk's prosperity was such that in 1803 it became the centre of the Siberian Governorate, and 2 years later actually released the Irkutsk Oblast as its own region. Due to the advancement of Russian colonization, as well as the security of a fixed Chinese border, more administration was needed, and in 1822 the region was reformed as the East Siberian Governorate. In 1825, with the failure of the Decembrist revolt during the interregnum between Alexander I and Nicholas I, a new stream of convicts came to the Irkutsk region. Yet this was not the same old mold of criminal, seeking and subject to a new life. Both in the city and in the villages that dot the region, a wave of intellectualism arose, with the politicians, nobility, artists and Renaissance men who arrived with their wives and children in the cold Siberian nights. The reputation of Irkutsk as the Paris of Siberia really arose around this time, as these exiles brought with them present fashions, ideas, sciences and culinary delights. During this time, geographical surveys of the land had been extremely fruitful too. By 1830, Irkutsk was the centre of gold processing in Russia. In 1851, the Trans-Baikal region was removed from the Irkutsk Oblast, in part to balance the administrative needs of both regions. In the same year that the population of Irkutsk city reached 28,000, the acquisition of the Amur region was made, opening up the Irkutsk region more easily to Pacific and Asiatic trade. Whilst this new access to the sea did reduce the value of Kyatka as well as the Siberian track to Moscow, the city advanced and prospered during this time. In 1879, Irkutsk was dragged, kicking and screaming, into the modern world, as a terrible fire burnt down 2/3 of the entire city, forcing it to be rebuilt in stone. Electricity reached Irkutsk in 1896, followed by a dedicated train line in 1898, allowing direct, easy transport straight to Moscow. In 1887, the region had been put under its own governorate, and by 1897 boasted a population of over 50,000 people. Siberia had always been a place of great value, whether that value being in furs, in gold, or something else. This would prove true in the 20th century, with between 1900 and 1914, 6 hydroelectric dams being built along the Bodaibo River, accounting for 1/6 of the entirety of the electricity produced in the Russian Empire. By 1910, Siberia was producing over 1 million tons of wheat and over 7,000 tons of butter, the Irkutsk Governorate accounting for a large portion of that. By 1911, the population of Irkutsk city had doubled again, at over 100,000 people, though this was swelled in part by the exodus of Russians in the Far East after losing the Russo-Japanese War. As the Siberian population grew and became more connected with the rest of Russia, the Irkutsk Oblast became less a place of exile and more a place of unrest. Growing demands for workers' rights, spurred on by Bolshevik, Menshevik, Trudovik, and Social Democrats, all parties who had members living in the Irkutsk Oblast at this time, led to demonstrations at the Lena goldfields. This turned violent on the 4th of April 1912, where Russian soldiers massacred hundreds of workers protesting for a living wage and better conditions. Though far away from the political centres of Russia, this story became quickly widely known and was held as yet another atrocity allowed by the Tsar. When the First World War broke out, the men of Irkutsk were called upon to fight, sending a steady stream of men westward to help with the lack of manpower in the fields, farms, and in the mines of Siberia. Prisoners of the Central Powers were transported to fulfill these positions. As the war went on and things got worse, certain elements of this prisoner population were recruited to aid the Russian cause. By the time of the Tsar's abdication in March of 1917, the city's population had shrunk to 90,000 and, like most of Russia, followed the provisional government that had replaced him. By December, when news of the Bolshevik coup in St. Petersburg had arrived, the city and region fell into running battles between pro- and anti-Bolshevik forces. This unrest did not die down, and although nominally the region supported the Bolsheviks, many revolts still occurred, notably in June of 1918. The Irkutsk lands were different to European Russia. Here a man could make a name for himself, make him rich on the fruits of his own labours, not be condemned to a cycle of poverty like his father and his father before him. And it was exactly this power base of small landowners, specialists, and tradesmen that only gave a lukewarm support to Bolshevik rule. In July of 1918, the Bolshevik forces in Irkutsk retreated along the train lines as the Czech Legion approached. As we mentioned in our video on the Chelyabinsk Oblast, the Czechoslovakian Legion were a group of Czechs and Slovaks formed from prisoners of war captured by the Russian Imperial Army, intent on fighting the Central Powers that occupied their home. With the coming of the Bolsheviks and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, this seemed near enough impossible, and thus they turned eastward. When the Bolsheviks tried to disarm them near Chelyabinsk, they revolted, and the White Cause gained 50,000 well-trained, armed and motivated Czechoslovakian soldiers. Taking Irkutsk, control was handed over to the Provisional Siberian Government, a white-aligned government made up of a mixture of political spectrums. This government, unable to keep the Czechs and short of manpower themselves, employed many Italian prisoners of war to help keep order in the city and oblast. By September, the Provisional All-Russian Government, also called the Directory, replaced the Siberian government. This was headed a month later by Admiral Kolchak, who turned the Directory into more of a dictatorship. These changes were in part due to the falling fortunes of the White Cause, and by October 1919, Irkutsk had become the de facto capital of the ailing white forces of the Russian Civil War. Those same diverse political forces that had ousted the Bolsheviks now turned on Kolchak. Disgruntled with his draconian command, they arranged for his training to be stopped in December, for him to be arrested and eventually handed over to Bolsheviks, who shot him in February of 1920. As the Bolsheviks cemented their rule across the Irkutsk Oblast and much of Siberia, great changes were made. Requisitions and demands for the still ongoing civil war brought a huge uprising across western Siberia in January of 1921. This revolt, largely made independently by small landowners, was brutally put down by the Red Army. And the following year, Irkutsk was made the centre of the Mongolian Buryat Autonomous Region. This rather peculiar decision was made for two good reasons. Firstly, at this time there was still a substantial Buryat population living in and around Irkutsk city. Secondly, having proven disloyal by revolting, this acted as an effective counterweight to the kulaks of western Siberia. In 1925, it was put into the Siberian Krai, followed 5 years later by the East Siberian Territory. Yet 1 more year later, the entire thing was scrapped, and the Irkutsk Oblast formed. Now, that's an awful lot of administrative and territorial changes in a relatively short period of time. The reasons for this, again, are twofold. Firstly, the Bolsheviks were still securing their newly acquired empire, and found some element of the previous orders difficult to make work in their system, and thus they amended them. Secondly, the 5-year plans introduced by the Soviets involved a reorganization of land, property and resources to meet their new targets, and thus a plethora of changes were made on economic reasons. This resulted in new maps, new commands and new allocations being made. With the outbreak of the German invasion in 1941, industry, investment and technology stopped flowing eastward to Irkutsk. What did arrive were refugees and technicians, with around 25,000 being specifically relocated to Irkutsk to aid war production. Making do with what they had, during the war years, production rose by 20% compared to 1940, and over 13 times compared to the 1913 levels. Using the huge resources available to them, thousands of guns, ammunition, fuel and food were sent westward. Between 1940 and 1945, the male population in Irkutsk dropped from 51% to just 20%. This was because thousands of men enlisted in the Red Army. Many who went to fight offered the first relief to the besieged Western Russian forces, and Siberian snipers from Irkutsk and beyond became the bogeymen of the Wehrmacht. As in the First World War, prisoners of war, when captured, were sent to work in the mines and fields, but rarely, if ever, were they recruited. Having escaped the destruction of the West, in 1945 a ton of investment and expansion occurred across the oblast, all in an effort to help rebuild the ravaged western part of the USSR. Petrochemicals, oil refinement, metallurgical construction and gold mining all developed during the post-war years, with several more hydroelectric power stations being built along the powerful Angara River to power this reconstruction. Unfortunately, in their desperation for a source of energy, Soviet authorities started looking at Lake Baikal, formerly sacrosanct to both the Buryats and the Siberiaks who had settled there. Despite protests, both a pulp and paper mill were built along its shores. For a long time, despite being very far away from the centres of power, the Irkutsk Oblast remained an important part of the USSR, providing huge amounts of energy and raw materials. When Perestroika came, then the fall of the Soviet Union, the region suffered as did everywhere. People lost jobs, savings, security, and even an understanding of what their world was. Due to having so many precious resources, the Irkutsk Oblast remained important in the post-Soviet world, and gradually, as things calmed down, received investment and development. In January 2008, a decision was made to merge the Ust-Orda Buryat Autonomous Okrug with the Irkutsk Oblast. This was a feature in line across much of the Russian Federation from the 2000s to 2010s, merging smaller regions with larger ones for ease of administration and funding. As the 5th largest federal subject, the Irkutsk Oblast covers an enormously large amount of area. With the changing climate and ecological problems that come with that, the region has been at the mercy of severe flooding as well as vast wildfires. It remains to be seen whether the future of the region will be a blessed one or a cursed one. But at the moment, things are going rather well. Wages in the Irkutsk Oblast are around 10% higher than elsewhere in Russia. Heavy industry makes up over a quarter of the GDP of the region, with lumber-related industries also making up a huge part of the GDP, providing up to 15% of the entirety of Russia's lumber and having 11% of all Russia's forests. Energy production is another huge industry, with 73% of Russia's entire hydropower coming from the Irkutsk Oblast. Gold production is also significant, with the Sukhoi goldfields being one of the largest deposits of gold in the entirety of the Russian Federation. Despite its mineral wealth, Only 2.7% of the Irkutsk Oblast is arable land, primarily producing grains. These are often sold as fodder to animals and sold abroad, but of course can and are used domestically as well. The Irkutsk Oblast is home to 2.4 million people as of the 2010 census, with 587,000 people living in the city itself. Unfortunately, both of those figures are lower than the 2002 census. The demographics of the region give a clear Russian majority at 88%. Small numbers of Buryats, Ukrainians and Tatars are present, with a multitude of smaller nationalities such as Belarusians, Armenians and Chuvash also present in the region. The population has a Christian majority at 40.5%, with over 25% being Russian Orthodox. People who are spiritual but not religious come in at 37%, with atheists coming in at 17.5%. Native faiths, such as Buryat Tengriism and Slavic Rodnoveri, come in at 2.2%, with Islam a mere 1.2%. The remaining 1.4% is made up of a mixture of various beliefs, as well as those who gave no official answer. Rates of drug abuse stand at 23 incidents of overdose per 100,000 people, higher than the national average. Likewise, rates of alcoholism are higher too, with 190 incidents of alcoholism per 100,000 people. The fertility rate in the region is 1.82 children per woman, higher than the national average. The governor of the region is Igor Kobzev, an ethnic Russian originally from Voronezh. He has been governor since September 2020 and is, of course, a member of the United Russia Party. The Irkutsk Oblast is home to some of the most spectacular nature in the entirety of the Russian Federation. Were you to visit, you may see Lake Baikal, the largest freshwater lake in the world, Olkan Island, a place of great importance in Buryat Tengriism, as well as the endless forests and national parks dotted across the oblast. Besides the wonderful nature, you might also visit the Taltsi Ethnographic Museum, which shows how life evolved over the years in the Irkutsk region. The city of Irkutsk itself rightly boasts to be the Paris of Siberia, with a plethora of museums, universities, statues, theatres and restaurants, all to visit. The Irkutsk Oblast is located in the heart of Russia, and in some respects that is exactly what it does, keeping Russia ticking along with its steady supply of raw materials and mineral wealth. My name is Andrew and thank you for watching. Up next is the Ivanova Oblast. Paka!